In this video, we will be replacing the valve cover gasket in this 2003 Toyota Camry. Taking a look inside the engine bay, we will be working on the centermost area of the engine. We first want to locate the plastic shroud that is covering our valve cover. On this plastic shroud, we have two 10mm bolts holding it down. We also have two hold down clips. And with just a little bit of force, we can pull that plastic cover off of those two hold down clips. And that will then expose our valve cover. Now on that valve cover, there are a few things we need to remove before that valve cover will come off. This engine has a fair amount of oozing, so it is suspect that the gasket has failed. On top of the valve cover, we do have our 4 ignition coils. We will have to remove these, which will expose the spark plug hole location. We're going to use a little bit of compressed air to blow away any debris so that it will not fall into that spark plug hole location. On the wiring harness for each of these ignition coils, we have a small tab that needs to be depressed before we can wiggle that off. And all of those ignition coils are connected to a hold down bracket. This has a 10mm bolt that we need to remove next. After that, we want to disconnect our air line connecting the valve cover to our air ducting. And this one's on there really good, so we will use a standard head screwdriver to help work that off. And that line has been on there so long, it's pretty rotted out. So we're going to replace that hose in this process. And that's hard as a rock. The next step is to remove the 4 bolts for my ignition coils. There's a good chance these have been in there a long time, so I will be applying Amsoil metal protector to help aid in the removal of these bolts. And I can take my 10mm ratchet and loosen up these bolts. And as I wiggle off these ignition coils, I want to check the base of the boots. If there is moisture on the base of those boots, it could indicate other problems. This one doesn't look too bad. That one's looking pretty good. That's looking pretty good as well. And not too bad. Taking a look at these ignition coils, I can see that there is oil residue, which would be a common occurrence if the valve cover gasket was leaking. What I didn't see was a spark plug hole location full of coolant. If that occurs, it is a different problem to deal with. And then on the far end, beyond our ignition coil locations, we have an additional 10mm bolt holding a bracket to a wiring harness. And then at the back of the valve cover, we have an additional air line to disconnect. And hopefully this one comes off a little bit easier than the previous one. Much better. Our valve cover has 10 10mm bolts. 8 of those bolts go around the perimeter, and we have 2 additional bolts in the center. I'm going to be applying Amsoil metal protector to each of these locations. This will aid in the removal of these bolts. And the hope is that these bolts will be relatively easy to remove. And that one was a little bit too easy. Now, as I go through and loosen up and remove each of these bolts, one thing that I am noticing is that these are pretty loose already. I'm going to guess that somebody worked on this previously and did not torque these down properly, because they just shouldn't be this loose. So the goal at this point, now that all of our bolts have been removed, we want to work the valve cover off of the rest of the engine. We do have a wiring harness on the right side and a wiring harness on the left side that will get in our way. So we need to try to work it around those as best as we can. And we also want to make sure that gasket comes off with it. And I can do a quick visual inspection inside there. Everything seems to be pretty good. I do not see any large amounts of sludge or buildup of any nature. That is a good sign. It does mean that the oil probably has been changed on a regular basis. And I always like to cover an open engine just to make sure that debris doesn't accidentally fall down there while I'm working on the valve cover. As I do a visual inspection of my valve cover gasket, this one is blue, and that is an indication to me that it has been replaced. So this essentially could be a new valve cover gasket. It does appear to be in good condition. I'm assuming the oil was probably oozing out because those valve cover gasket bolts were not torqued properly. We're going to go ahead and replace this anyways. And I will be using Amsoil engine degreaser to help clean this entire component inside and out. Specifically, we want to make sure to clean the grooves which the gasket will sit in. And with that all cleaned up, we are looking pretty good. And I'm going to come back with just a little bit of Amsoil brake and parts cleaner and make sure the grooves are perfectly clean, as well as the grooves where those spark plugs go. And at this point, I'm going to double check and make sure that my gasket fits properly. And this one is looking good. So I can go ahead and make sure that it gets seated all the way in that groove. This will also help prevent it from falling out when I install this back on the vehicle. Shifting our focus back to the engine, I will be using some acetone on a rag to clean this mating surface. I want to make sure that I don't push any of the debris back into the engine though. And we're also going to address those areas where the spark plugs go, as well as those bolt locations. Now we also have a location near our timing chain where there is an extra glob of sealant. This needs to be cleaned off as well prior to installation of our new gasket. There should be one on the front and one on the back. We need to install another glob of our gasket maker on either side of the timing chain prior to installing the cover. Our next challenge is to install our valve cover with that new gasket back into the original location, and then we can work that cover on. After that, we can install all of our bolts by hand first. We want to make sure that there is no chance of cross-threading these. And I'm going to come back with a socket and just make these hand tight. I'm going to kind of jump around a little bit just so we can get nice even pressure all around the valve cover. Now the repair manual says to tighten the valve cover bolts to 96 inch-pounds, but we want to do this in 3 or 4 increments. So the first sequence we're going to 32 inch-pounds, then we'll be going to 64 inch-pounds, and then we'll finish it up at 96 inch-pounds. And round 2 is 64 inch-pounds. And then round 3 will be our final 96 inch-pounds. And at this point, we can go ahead and reinstall everything, beginning with our bolt for our wiring harness. Next, we have the ignition coils and the corresponding bolts. Followed by our wiring harnesses. And we have that additional bolt for our bracket holding our wiring harness. And I was able to track down that broken ventilation hose. Oh! And our existing hose has an extra piece of insulation on it. We're going to see if we can reuse this onto our new hose. We're also going to go ahead and see if we can reuse those spring clamps. And that Amsoil metal protector seemed to do the trick. Now I always like to verify that I am working with the same part. This one looks good. We'll add our extra insulator there. And then see if we can get that back installed. And I like the way that turned out. And we have that additional hose in the back. And after that, we can install our cover.